Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar panel. I'm Kristen Evans, VP of Marketing here at ChoiceWorks, and our topic today is scaling in the hyper-automation era. And we have a great lineup of speakers who have deep experience in this space, and we're really looking forward to a great conversation. I just want to cover a few things before we get started. First, we will be sending out the recording of today's session to all registrants, so you can expect that later this week. And secondly, we want to make sure we have an interactive conversation today, so we encourage you to ask your questions in the questions box, and we'll be responding to those as we go along. Also, we're going to leave this slide up that you're seeing here with the speaker information, but know that you can reduce the size of that window by using the gray bar between the speaker video images and the slide. So with that, I'm going to hand things off to our moderator today, Frank Casal, co-founder and chief revenue officer here at ChoiceWorks. Frank?
Great. Thank you, Kristen, and welcome all. First off, I want to make sure I just thank you, Kristen, for helping to produce, Tom Walkett as well, helping to produce today's session. I know there are a lot of moving parts, and to all those who helped, thank you very much. For those of you in attendance, greetings. We have a great discussion planned for today. As you may well know, RPA is the hottest trend, the fastest growing trend under the broader heading of digital transformation. That's the good news. The bad news is many out there, many of you are struggling to scale, and that is the topic that we are hitting head on today with two expert advisors and two experienced practitioners. This is designed to be an interactive kind of a video panel and discussion. I have a handful of starter questions which I will leverage to kick things off, but it's really designed to answer your questions. So if you have any questions, I'm sure many of you, most of you are familiar with this format. Please submit your questions and we will do our best to answer any and all. Before we dive in, we do have a limited time and these things do tend to fly by. Allow me to introduce our panelists. Let me start with welcoming Ben Rayner, Global Head of Productivity and Innovation at Citi Capital Markets. Sydney Madison Prescott, Global Intelligent Automation Lead at Spotify. Paul Pinto, Founder and Managing Partner at Sylvan Advisory. And last but certainly not least, Mike Engel, Intelligent Automation Leader at PwC. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, and thank you for participating. So Paul, I want to start with you with a very basic question. What is the issue here as you see it working with your clients? Why are people struggling with scaling RPA?
Yeah, so we kind of go back to the beginning, Frank. Most of our customers purchase RPA and they justify the purchase by developing an ROI model, a return on investment. In order to get that return on investment, they have to look at the total cost of ownership, which includes the cost of the RPA software, the cost of developing the robots, and then the cost to maintain the robots. That last piece, the cost to maintain the robots, is the piece everybody's a little squishy on. And what they don't realize until they get there is you need an economy of scale in order to manage the cost of maintaining robots. So it costs a lot to maintain 10 robots on a per robot basis. It costs a lot less to maintain 100 or 1,000 robots on a per robot basis. But customers don't realize that until they have to maintain 1,000 robots. And then it throws the ROI calculation out of sync with what their expectations were.
And Mike Engel, what we're hearing through our network is the efficiencies, the increased productivity people anticipated by developing these bots kind of begins to go away as they realize the costs and the resources involved with just managing them on the back end. Is it that simple? Is that what you're seeing within your client base?
Yeah, absolutely, Frank. I mean, it's there's a lot of different components here. And Paul, I was just going to jump all over you there when you got started, but a lot of reasons why these pilots just fail to scale, right? And I think chief among these things, though, Frank, is in addition to ROI and the different metrics, is they just fail to excite, right? we have all these wonderful promises that we make, and as vendors, as internal leaders within these groups, we make all these promises, but we never really meet them, and we get into this infinite pilot mode that we never get out of. So I think there are a number of different reasons of why that happens, and it's not just about the metrics.
No, so that's a fairly good point. So Ben, you are an experienced practitioner. Citi, I would say Citi in general is fairly active, one of the early adapters in the space. I remember the meetings, my goodness, 6, 7 years ago. But within your group, certainly you've been working with RPA for a while. What are some of the challenges that you've come across as you've attempted to scale and kind of just increase the footprint within your organization?
I think some of the key ones around having the right infrastructure in place.
Ben, having trouble.
Can you hear me now?
Ben, having trouble
Yes.
with audio.
You hear me now? Okay.
Yeah, better. Thank you.
So some of the key ones started with having the right infrastructure in place. I think making sure that we had centralized utilities for actually hosting bots. It took us a while to set that precedent up, but once it was running, then it worked very well. The primary one we had from day one was really which tools, very simply, which tools should we use, and how can we create the business case for those benefit investments within the organization, and of course that very human element of getting people along for the ride and finding the right use cases. So we took a very data-driven approach. We never had any targets for rolling out numbers of bots. We always set targets around outcome-based metrics. We selected the business processes very carefully, and we effectively then scaled the business process usages once we found a good use case for that. And then with that, as we were able to scale, we then layered in other technologies, which beyond rules-based RPA, which actually then enabled us to automate the end-to-end process, and then latterly into the client domain as well. So it was very much an organic learning journey for us, measured, organic, and layered, so that we can actually achieve the right buy-in and the right controls and right infrastructure along the way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Ben. I had trouble hearing you at the beginning, but it did get better. I think we're okay now. So, Sydney, let's switch over to you. You're more on the kind of on the front end of the journey, and you remain positive, just as I've sensed from previous discussions. What are you seeing just coming out of the gate with regard to these challenges, or whether it's bots breaking or just this overall ability to scale? Are you still in the honeymoon period, or are you maybe just beyond?
I definitely think we are just beyond at Spotify. Thankfully, we have a great team with prior experience in RPA and specifically in how to scale out centers of excellence. So one of the things, and I think this is key that Ben pointed out, is really understanding how to set your targets. And one of the great things that we have done is we've really steered away from the focus on how many bots can we put into production, and we've really focused on business value. So the entire program is driven by what is the value that we are providing back to the business, and how many business units are we touching, and also how are we creating almost a network within Spotify of process automation that interconnects the different teams together and leverages the downstream and upstream potential. And because of that, we've really avoided, we're avoiding one, creation of automation silos, which I think that definitely becomes a hurdle with a lot of centers of excellence. But then also we are providing our stakeholders with the type of value where they are willing to become then our evangelists and really market RPA throughout the business and to other stakeholders, so that, which also then brings additional buy-in from a business perspective, which is great to the program.
And Sydney, are you similar to Ben? Do you anchor less on the number of bots, if I heard that correctly? So that's interesting. I'd like to come back to that in a moment, because typically when I speak with enterprise practitioners, the conversation tends to focus on, hey, we've developed 20 bots or 200 or 2,000. Almost that's kind of, those are the metrics, if you will. So it's interesting to see that both you and Ben. So we'll come back to that in a moment. However, I was asked to, I think, Kristen, is this the right time for me to, for us to go to a survey polling question, I think, according to my crib notes here. So, okay, so those of you who, you've probably done this before, right? So this is a question, as long as I can reorganize my screen a little bit here. What are the primary reasons why companies have not been able to scale? So this is based on your experience, or if you're a provider or advisor, based on your client's experience. And you see the options, if you could please, we'll give you 30 seconds. Pick one, you only get to pick one. And then let's see, obviously we'll share the results right on the back end.
Hey, Frank, while we're waiting, can I just jump in on something that both Ben and Sydney brought up, and I think is really important.
Sure, go for it.
Yeah, I guess I already did. So this point about business value focus, I think that's really critical, and I don't think we can say it enough, right? That we have a tendency in some of these pilots to continue to spiral to just think about the technology, how exciting it is, shiny new toy thing, as opposed to moving a needle and through this, and that drives the scale. So I think that's common among these two practitioners and why they've had such success, right?
Okay, that's a good point.
And Mike, let me just dovetail on that. So Mike, to the points made, right, the value is measured in the return on investment back to the business, right? Fair enough. However we calculate it, and we've seen customers calculate it in minutes saved, hours saved, increased quality, enhanced productivity, right? There's a lot of ways that or diminished risk, right? Or in association with compliance and regulations. So there's a lot of ways it squeezes out, but all that's predicated on the bot that was developed, that was conceived, has to stay up and running, right? The more downtime we get from a bot, the less ROI we get from a bot.
Super. So Tom, are you able to share the results of the polling question? Okay, so 24% are basically always too hard to identify the best processes to automate. So that's interesting. Find the early candidates. Slightly more, 32% responded that creating bots is much more complicated than expected. No surprise there. By the way, jumping to the bottom, even voting response of tracking benefits. And then last but not least, bot maintenance is too expensive. So, Mr. Engel, are you surprised at that those responses, or how does that line up with kind of how you anticipated the response to be?
No, that makes perfect sense to me. I would expect it to be something like that, because we're talking about the bookends here, right? The top response there, I guess, was, hey, what do I automate next? Where do the ideas come from, and all that sort of thing. So once that low-hanging fruit is picked, what's next? So that doesn't surprise me at all. Bot maintenance, I think one of the reasons it might be a little bit of a surprise to me is because maybe people aren't measuring the cost.
Right. Right. Yeah, that was a surprise to me. Sydney, how would you weigh in on that the results? Is that in line with your thinking, or any observations?
It is. I think it's very interesting. The big call out, creating bots is more complicated than expected. So this is something that I have seen quite often during my intelligent automation career, whereby our C-suite executives have a preconceived notion of the simplicity of RPA and the simplicity of the creation of these types of automation. And I've heard a lot of kind of catchphrases as, it's macros on steroids and things of this nature, which I do think, unfortunately, this is something, a message that has been conveyed through the kind of the vendor marketing, where it's low code, no code. You can have there's talks of you can have a bot up and running in a few days and things of this nature. And part of the challenge with that notion is that you then come into sort of you can't really level set the expectations from your senior leadership if they already have the expectation that it's super simple, anybody can do it, and then you start building out these complex business processes where it may be something where you're automating a SOX control, or you're automating a process that has a large number of systems that you need to navigate between. And then if you start getting pushback from your business stakeholders, from your senior leadership, about the time that it's taking to build out that automation. So I think it's absolutely critical to really look at, how am I setting the expectation in relation to the complexity of robotic process automation? It is definitely more complicated than I would say the majority of vendors kind of market it as, that strategy, particularly because you're really looking at how complex are your business processes, and how complex are the systems that you're going to be, that you need to integrate with from an RPA perspective. And that really should set the tone more so than the notion that it's relatively easy, anyone can do it, because that even comes down to the level of talent that you have to pull from in relation to RPA development.
Super. And I want to come back to talent in a moment, because there's a question submitted from one of the attendees here around skill sets. I'll come back to you in a moment on that. Ben, I'm curious if you were to vote and submit a vote with regards to this poll, which answer would you have clicked on?
Do you hear me more clearly now, by the way?
Yes, much better. Thank you.
Oh, good. It's difficult to choose between them, quite honestly. I think that creating bots is more complicated than expected, is really the primary one that kind of came across here as well to some extent. I think there's a lot of hype when companies first engage to kind of oversimplify the not just the implementation, but the support and the orchestration of bots. It's very easy to be kind of swayed by easy wins and kind of one-off use cases. So I think, one of the things that certainly set us in good stead along the way, and I kind of alluded to it earlier on, is that we chose use cases very carefully, and I think in the early days we probably failed a good 50% of the time. Of course, at that level, it's having the right support in the organization to enable you to fail and to carry on, right? But then of course you're faced with all the other challenges that are noted here as well. And of course all of that still comes back to basic human change management as well. Of course, making sure that we can work on a business process that has the right sponsorship with partners who are truly engaged and actually want to make the automation work, because I think that's one of the other complicating factors. That of course, with the best will in the world, the part of the business process is automated, but if people don't want to change their behavior and come along for the ride, then that makes the challenge doubly difficult.
And Ben, Cindy referred to moments ago the fact that she had a handful of experienced people on her team, so maybe less risk there, less of a learning curve. And I want to read one of the questions that was submitted by an attendee here. Basically says, I'd like to hear the panel's thoughts on a fifth option relating to the polling question. And in the panel's experience, what are the most difficult skill sets to source when hiring, and where do you feel the future skill shortages will be? So Ben, let's start with you, and Sydney, I'm curious what you think. Two-part question, right? Critical skill sets, and then where do you think the crunch is going to be, let's say this time next year?
Well, I think, of course, it depends where you are on your RPA journey to some extent also, right? So the critical skill sets that we found in the earlier days with pure play RPA were not just technology experience, but business experience as well, and trying to blend the two. So we started off with a team of effectively repurposed core platform engineering folks who knew the applications that they would be integrating with very well, on an assumption that of course they would be able to pick up the RPA relatively quickly, and that was true absolutely in the early days. I think where we then started to get more into, or where the technologies moved more into Java-based technologies, more into data science technologies, those skills are certainly more difficult. Well, Java is not difficult to find, but the application of Java in the way that it needs to be used to make some of these tools work is a very new discipline, I think. and we struggle. And then latterly, as we get into utilizing the analytics that come off the back of some of the machine learning engines, then data science, predictive analytics, those sorts of skills are super hot on the market, difficult to come by, and again, very difficult to find experienced practitioners who understand how to apply them in a business context.
Super. And Sydney, you alluded to the fact that you started with your kind of automation dream team there, and you already have experience. What's the ideal profile of that person? And again, where do you anticipate the crunch being by this time next year or slightly beyond?
I think it's definitely in finding someone who has experience in enterprise level RPA development. What I struggle with a lot of the times is sourcing developers who have learned RPA a lot of the times like through the vendor educational tools and certifications, but they don't have the expertise of actually working within a center of excellence. And even more importantly, a center of excellence where you are scaling, where you're consistently cranking through ideation through development, UAT, and production. So finding those experienced RPA developers, and I would even go a step further. My preference, excuse me, is always to have developers that have previous just development experience, whether it's .NET, C#, Java, whatever. I found those are the strongest RPA developers, the developers who come from a different, know other programming languages and have added RPA to their repertoire versus those who only have the RPA experience. It's definitely doable, but it's harder to get them up to speed when you're really trying to crank through, again, at an enterprise level from COE perspective. So I think that skill of if you are a traditional developer in any language, adding RPA to your skill set, I think that is going to be extremely beneficial in the coming years, as well as, of course, adding OCR, machine learning, natural language processing, like that entire stack to your skill set.
Great, thanks, Sydney. Paul Pinto, both you and Mike Engel, your respective teams actually provide bot management services, right? So you're also hiring. So what do you see as critical skill sets? And what is your, let's say, a warning to those out there who have to think about hiring in the future of where the challenges may be?
Yeah, I would echo with what both Sydney and Ben had said. The thing I would add to it is when we look for folks who can design and architect bots at an enterprise level. So a lot of people can develop bots. And to Sydney's point, it's really well taken. Some just know an RPA tool, and that's really not enough. If they come from a development language and know an RPA tool, wonderful. If they can extend their skill set to other areas of automation beyond just RPA, to include machine learning, machine reasoning, orchestration, also good. But then it comes down to architecture. So do you design one big complex bot that has the propensity to break a lot? Or do you design a number of smaller bots? And perhaps there's a push and pull against the cost of software licenses that pulls you away from doing that. So there's a lot of considerations. And RPA is not the answer for every automation. There's other tools like Python that are very well suited, or Java, as Sydney had mentioned, which could be used in lieu of RPA. So it really is an issue of architecture and design. And I'll answer your question directly, Frank. When we get engaged to do bot maintenance, we end up refactoring 50% of the bots. So a lot of times they're overbuilt and overcomplex and therefore break too often. So we refactor them into more manageable bots.
Super. Mike Engel, knowing that everybody in the industry would love to work for Mike Engel, so it's probably easier for you from a recruiting standpoint, Mike. But what type of anything you would add from the standpoint of skill sets as you're hiring?
Yeah, I think it's really, I'm just going to add on to what everybody else said, right? So it's that engineering mindset that Sydney was talking about, right? It's convergence of technologies that Ben was talking about. But Paul, I think it's really become a real multiplier with the different technologies that we're dealing with now, and identifying and hiring and training up the right solution architecture teams, right? That's become just kind of a big deal for us.
Okay, so let me jump over. Ben, you mentioned something before that I had to jot down, and I have to come back to. You mentioned that 50% of your efforts failed, 50% failure rate early on. Now, many organizations, either somebody would be in trouble, right, like Ben, or they would say, hey, this RPA stuff is bad, RPA is dead, and all these other things. My sense and hope neither of those happen. Is that a matter of setting, were you just experienced enough and clever enough to set expectations? Is it more about having stakeholders that are understanding and patient? What is your advice to others that may be about to fail a bit, and how to deal with that?
Well, to answer your question, I used to have an awful lot more hair before I started my RPA journey, so I can't say I never got into trouble with it. But the failure is obviously looked at in different ways. You know, there are particularly we found in the early days that some of our more traditional core engineering teams were always looking for it to fail because it's seen as a threat to some of the more conventional platform technologies out there, right? So and others, of course, from a business perspective, those who are kind of resistant to change are also looking for reasons as to why it might not be successful. So it's for me, it's always been a matter of proving small wins, finding the right sponsors, proving true value, which I think is difficult. I think that's one. Back to the earlier points around how to select use cases well, and I think finding that sweet spot for it, it does require some element of failure, right? So to the detractors from it, really, for us, it's been a case of finding the stronger stakeholders, finding the right, most compelling use cases, and proving that they can extend. Because I think that's one of the other key points, which of course we've touched on before. If it's just a one-trick event, then it may be a great use case, but it's not providing true value to the business. So finding that extendability, and quite frankly, just being a little bit thick-skinned at times, right? Because it's in any change management function, whether it's tech related or whether it's business process related, there are always going to be obstacles and failures, and it's about moving through those and gaining support, increasingly as you go. In my experience.
Mm-hmm. No, super. And Sydney, any stories where I'm sure it's easier to glow in the success of certain efforts, but every once in a while, we've all been there at some of these efforts, right? That there's a challenge where it just doesn't work. Have you had one or two? And what is your advice to those that may be about to get close to those types of scenarios?
I will pride myself very lucky. I have not had any failed attempts at setting up a center of excellence, which definitely, knock on wood, and I think that's great. But I think it really, if I look back to the very first center of excellence that I started, that was back in 2015, the way that we were able to successfully navigate the potential pitfalls is the focus was on managing the expectation. So I would present directly to the CTO and really started this out as a true pilot. We really wanted it to be, and we had very specific timeframes, very specific KPIs that we wanted to reach. And then we also had a strategic roadmap for where we were versus where we wanted to be. And I think that's very key. And I think Ben alluded to that, is making sure that you can manage the expectations of your, whether it's your evangelist, whether it is your executive sponsor, but setting those guardrails around the value that you see in the program in the long run versus where you start at the beginning. And I think if you can set that structure, and then also if you can really select the right stakeholders to target, and not try to boil the ocean for starting out, that's where you really start. You can basically give yourself the room to ramp up slowly.
No, makes sense. Mike, when you're brought in as an advisor or someone to help bring a solution to the table, a common question, right? Where do we begin, or where's the low-hanging fruit? And the question is asked so many times, yet we could all agree that is a challenge, right? And not everyone gets it right. What do you feel are the the key ingredients there? Is it as simple as, you know, F&A or finance back office? Is it as simple as kind of a use case, or is it more about receptivity and maybe, you know, political heat map, things along those lines? Or how would you describe, what is your definition of an ideal place or two to begin?
Yeah. So there's a lot of different ways to define it, Frank, but at the end of the day, it's part of what we've all been alluding to, and that is that there has to be some proof of the value, right? So there must be a needle that we can move as a result of building whatever, you know, whether it's your first automation or your 50th, doesn't matter, right? So we need to be able to tie it to something that we can measure. You know, there are obvious, you know, technical things around, you know, stability of underlying systems and all of that you need to take into consideration. But I think chief among the things we should be considering, what we tell our clients to consider, is make sure that it's going to be value that can be proven as a result of this effort.
Okay, so let's get tactical here for a moment, Mike. I'll stay with you, and then maybe Paul, if you could maybe weigh in. Let's talk about supporting bots, right? Continues to be a challenge, regardless of the experience level out there. What do you see are the most common challenges, Mike? And what do you recommend? You know, what are your recommendations as far as a strategy and approach to bot support, you know, maintenance, et cetera?
Yeah, again, the first thing is having a balanced discussion with your client, right? In our case, it's not the most glamorous part of the whole automation journey, right? So we want to make sure that you know, they felt a little bit of the pain here, so they understand kind of the need for this, to have this discussion, right? It's one of these growing up type of discussions. But you know, I think Paul alluded to it earlier. You know, when you talk about you know, the biggest challenges here, it's really about blowing up your ROI or whatever the metric is that you're using, right? Because typically, and I count myself as one of these people, we don't really consider kind of that cost associated with maintaining and supporting these automation programs. And we end up with this kind of linear progression of cost associated with it, and we really didn't see it coming, right? Another challenge, I think, is really around stalling the program generally, because we take the same bot engineers, hard to find people that Sydney was referring to before, and we have them maintaining the bots that they build, kind of a do-it-yourself type of approach to that, right? Installing the program. So a couple of things, Frank, that we talk to our clients about. First is establishing a framework, and we basically just, you know, take an ITSM and modified it to be automation service management, right? So think about the framework you're going to use to, you know, manage, monitor, maintain the kind of automations once you get the program in place. And then the other part of it that I hope we get into a little bit more today is why not automate some of this work ourselves, right? So we can kind of reduce that linear progression of cost and just do it with better quality.
Super. So Paul, if you could weigh in, you've heard me talk, you know, plenty, speak to broken bot syndrome, and then just overall challenges. It might be the fact that bots are breaking off and that they're brittle, and then just it's fairly inefficient for most to monitor, manage, maintain. Heard something recently from a small roundtable I know Mike was involved in, where there was this frustration around a team being focused on developing bots, and every time there were challenges on the back end where something broke, it was just kind of borrowing a couple of those resources to switch them over to fixing or repairing broken bots, and then to jump back over to developing. None of that sounds efficient. So what are you seeing out there, and what are you recommending to your clients?
Yeah, to emphasize the point Mike made, we see a lot. The person who developed the bot ends up maintaining the bot, and that's usually in the early stages. Every hour they spend maintaining a bot is an hour they're not spending developing new bots. So that's a tremendous waste of that elite skill set, and we see it all too often. So for example, the customers that we deal with typically have less than 200 bots in production, typically mid-size companies, and they have a handful of elite developers who are also doing maintenance. And that's problematic. One, it's never calculated in the ROI cost. So the cost of maintenance is really the same rate as development, but that's kind of under the covers. They don't acknowledge that. So that's a problem because it erodes ROI, and the developers aren't free to develop new bots, which is also problematic. They should be freed up to go develop new and interesting bots, which enhances ROI for the same fixed costs. So the key is to scale, to get as many bots in production as one can without upgrading the fixed cost, the cost of the software.
And just let's stay there for a moment, Paul. How do your clients justify? I guess at that point, if they get it, then they have to determine, do they do it in-house or they do it with a third party? And obviously, there's a bunch that have determined it makes more sense to do it with a third party. How do they come to that conclusion? What is the formula to determine, do it yourself versus call Paul, Mike, or anyone else that provides this type of service?
Yeah, Frank. So typically we have to show them what they're currently paying for in-house support of the existing bots. So for every hour they steal of a developer's time, that developer costs $75 an hour for him or her, and multiply that by the number of bots in production and the amount of time. So we found that a typical client, one FTE, one full-time equivalent, is required to support somewhere between 18 and 28 bots in production per month. So depending on the number of bots you have, you may have a number of FTEs dedicated to it, but it's split across 20 people. And they don't realize that leakage until we're able to show it to them. And then we can show them an alternate model that says, hey, if you were to outsource this to a third party, and here's the time and material cost for that, or perhaps to someone who's using a tool like ChoiceWorks to automate the bot maintenance process, where you can get to a fixed fee per bot per month that's significantly lower than what they're currently paying. Then it becomes eye-opening to them.
Okay, Mike, I always like to pay.
You're going there a little bit, right? So there's the cost associated with it, but there's also the opportunity cost, right? Starts to approach. So what's the cost of not approaching your backlog, right?
Yeah, it's a great point, Mike. Great point.
That's a really good point. And Mike, I'm curious, how do you weigh in on some of the ratios as far as resources to bot maintenance? I love to pit you against Pinto on this stuff.
Yeah. It's about time.
Do you agree with those numbers? Are they similar to what you're seeing for the most part?
I think that Paul's numbers are really optimistic, and I hope you're right, Paul. But I don't think there's really enough data yet, so it's pretty anecdotal. And I think we've had these discussions with people on this phone and others, and I think that the ratio is a little bit lower, right? More like one person to maybe 10 or 12. And I know there are those situations where it's much higher, 30s maybe, but I'd say by and large it's closer to 10 to 12.
Okay, super. I'm getting notification that this is the opportunity for the next polling question. So Tom, if you could help. And again, folks, take a look, see. Let me shift my screen around so I can see it. Okay. What will be the most popular way companies manage their bot fleet? Again, I love that term, bot fleet. Do it yourself, outsource it, insource it, or some sort of a blended approach. Please pick one, and let's see how everyone weighs in.
Hey, Frank, while we're waiting on the response to attendees, I'd like to put Mike's contention to the test and ask Ben and Sydney, if you were pressed and asked, what's your FTE per number of bots maintained? And I realize that both of you aren't hung on the number of bots, but I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Sydney, you want to go first?
Yeah, I think I would say probably closer to Michael's estimate. I would think probably 10 to 15 bots max. But I do want to caveat that with saying that if you are proactive in the way that you actually design your bots, you can maneuver yourself away from a lot of the breakage and maintenance issues. So I think it's really about incorporating that true kind of test mentality even into your solution design and to make it as easy as possible to maintain the bots rather than almost like reactively trying to address the problems once the bot is already in production.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough. Ben, how would you weigh in?
I would go with about 1 to 15. One person supporting around 15 bots. Okay. Again, I mean, Sydney's spot on. It very much depends on the complexity of the process, on the way those bots have been designed and implemented. I mean, we certainly found that the supports ratio was much, much lower in the early days, i.e. it required much more hand-holding for the bots because again, frankly, back to the failure point, we didn't design them well. We didn't implement them particularly well. The code wasn't great. And so when we came through with a second wave and refactored them, there were huge benefits once we had more knowledge of how to use the technology. So it significantly reduced the support, but it's still there. And there's also a hidden support cost as well that we find. I'm sure other people either do or will find this too, around the controls and the compliance. Paul mentioned the architectural side of things earlier on as well. You know, there's a whole, depending on the interest of the wider organization, you know, it can involve, you know, a lot more people and parts of the organization than purely the developers and the support personnel.
Super, thank you. So let's take a look at the results. Obviously, the big winner here is a hybrid approach with dedicated support for level 1 or 2. Clearly, you know, 60% there is a big slice of the pie chart, and then almost evenly distributed between DIY, outsource, and in-source. So, Mike Engel, when you're speaking to your clients, you know, what are you hearing and what are you recommending? You know, and how are you coming to your conclusion based on the nature of the profile of that client, if you will?
Obviously, I'm recommending that they work with us on it. Right. So that's a quick answer, right? But I think it is, you know, all 4 of these make sense. I'm surprised that the hybrid was quite so high. And I think it may have something to do with the type of organization, right? The size of the organization, where they are in the kind of the journey or the evolution of the program might dictate some of these answers. But yeah, I think that the key thing here is that there's, you know, it's one of the bottom 3 where it's dedicated in some form, fashion to support, as opposed to that DIY type of an approach is what we're recommending.
Mm-hmm. My prediction is, if I could weigh on this, I believe that the do-it-yourself option will become less and less attractive for several reasons. Probably the leader of the reasons is it's going to be tough to find the talent. And the turnover is going to be high. There's going to be strong market demand. So even once you hire a handful, turnover rates start to approach 25, 30%. It may be easier for most just to rely on a third party and just to rely on consistent SLAs than to be able to rely on a strategy that requires your team to consistently be able to hire and retain this talent. We shall see. But I believe if we conduct this same poll a year from now, I think the results would be a bit different. I'm just keeping an eye on the clock, and we have just about 15 minutes or so left, and there's a whole bunch of questions coming in. I promised everyone that we would do our best to answer as many questions as possible. So hang in there with me. Okay, so here's one. Getting buy-in from team members is a big challenge in adoption of RPA. This viewer says, I myself have faced it when I was selling it within a large organization. Can any of the panelists please focus on a need of creating a more informed organization? So Sydney, how much of your work involves education and awareness as to what this is, what it does, you know, the art of the possible, and by the way, what it does not do, you know, internal PR and education, if you will. Is that a part of your role?
Absolutely. I think that is a huge component of a successful center of excellence, being able to educate your business stakeholders about what you can provide and how you can provide it, and what is the purpose, right, of RPA within the broader framework of the enterprise. And I think I would say our success in that kind of internal marketing strategy has come a lot from we are engaged with PwC as a partner, which is great. We have conducted like opportunity workshops, and those really are all about informing the stakeholder. I like to say about the art of the impossible, so the things that you never thought you could automate, right, or the things that you said nobody would ever dedicate the time to automating this, but it's a huge pain point from a business standpoint. Looking at those opportunities and really showcasing to the business that we are truly a shared service, and that our our full function as an RPA COE is to make sure that we can offer that value back to the business. And that goes a long way to get that buy-in, right? To say that we are very hands-on. We really want to understand your business process. We want to understand how we can optimize it. Rather than thinking of ourselves as almost like an external team that really is more just of a support function. So it's really about engaging, and during your marketing, having a strong platform for a partnership, a true partnership between the COE and the business.
Super. Ben, is that a part of your focus as well, or is there someone else on your team or in the organization who helps educate the art of the possible? And as Sydney mentioned, I love that quote, art of the impossible as well.
Yeah, I mean, Sydney's spot on. Yeah, it's a huge part of my role. It's hearts and minds at the end of the day, right? And I think that the absolute key thing is, I mean, you said it, Frank, what it can't do, right? People first hear these messages around these huge automation ratios and things for the workforce perspective, and the reality is that doesn't happen significant, on its own in the early days. In my experience, it takes a bit of growth and maturity in how to deploy the technologies to really start to get that kind of uptick in benefits, right? So that to me is the absolute key. It's really working with people so that they get over the fear of losing their jobs, and they learn to harness the technologies and really work with it. And we've certainly found that putting it in their own hands works hugely effectively as well. So giving people access to to low-code solutions, no-code solutions, and actually letting them play with them. We certainly find that certainly the younger demographic of our workforce actually want much more hands-on, hybrid roles between operations and technology, and they welcome the opportunity to actually take it out of the hands of the technologists and democratize it themselves and manage their own work. So we're very much my whole ethos on change management towards it is very much a human element, and the rest will come, frankly.
Okay, no, good points. So we have just a little over 10 minutes, and I have a handful of questions. Let's see if we could do lightning round here. So Mike, I think you'd like this question. Question has to do with allowing the business users to really develop their own bots. So very controversial topic. People very much for, people very much against. Where are you, Mike? I think I know where you are, but where are you, Mike?
Yeah. No, look, it's happening, Frank, and I think it's going to become more of a standard. This sense of citizen versus business-led automation, right? And just quick, since you said lightning, we have situations time and time again where something is built by a citizen or the business in this question, that leads to an idea that is then industrialized by the COE or kind of the center, right? That changes it from being somebody's pain that they've created capacity in their own workforce, in their own workday, a couple hours here or there, that turns into tens of thousands of hours once it's industrialized. So suffice it to say, I'm a big fan.
Super. Sydney, how would you weigh in on that?
Definitely a fan. I think in the ideal scenario, if you're looking for a true digital transformation of your entire enterprise, you have to incorporate citizen development into that. In order to scale the developers in the COE, it would be impossible to tackle everything you need to tackle. So I think true digital transformation, definitely a mix of citizen-led and COE-led.
Okay. Is anyone on this panel against citizen-led or any cautions?
Yeah, I would offer a caution. So the bots developed by citizens aren't typically great production bots, but they were really good business level bots. I've had clients use those as specifications for industrializing them into real bots. So the end user, the business person, believes it's their bot, so be it. But we take it in the COE and redevelop it to make it a good and compliant bot.
I think it's a question of governance, isn't it, Paul? Right? I mean, there's obviously some guardrails that we have to think about, but I don't know that you go and industrialize every single bot that gets created. It could be thousands.
Well, it's a really good point, Mike. And not every bot developed by a business person can be industrialized or should be industrialized.
Okay, so next question. When refactoring older bots, how did you handle the ROI calculation? Was it enhancement or considered a new bot with its own ROI? Sydney, is that something you can take a shot at?
Yeah, definitely considered it an enhancement. And the way that we calculated the ROI is the amount of time that we anticipated being able to use the bot, but it was actually allocated towards failures versus once we refactor, how can we regain that time that we initially thought we'd have for the ROI? So almost like a balance of how much troubleshooting did you have to do versus the downtime of that bot when it was not refactored and was failing more often.
Okay, great, Ben. Enhancement or new bot ROI?
New bot most of the time, because the truth of the matter is, for the majority of the bots we found that need to be refactored, they hadn't lived up to their full potential in the first place, and they were also taking a lot of effort to support. So actually, by the time we went back and refactored them, effectively it was net effect was effectively recreating the bot, and then we did get the benefit that we were originally projecting, and of course the support cost drops away at that point too.
Okay, super. So question here, in terms of bot support, it's usually, no, this is another question, if you will. In terms of bot support, it's usually reactive in nature. Has the panel done something in their organization to make the support area more proactive? Mike, I'll give you a chance to weigh in, maybe some of the things that you're doing with your clients. How much of it is how would you define the mix of reactive versus proactive?
Yeah, well, changing. That's how I would put it, right? So we have done things from an automation perspective around being able to predict where there might be failures, be able to auto-remediate thanks to our friends at ChoiceWorks, and just really adding technology to that whole mix so that we can understand where the failures are going to occur, and just be able to get ahead of it. So that doesn't mean we're not still reactive. I mean, there are tickets that come right through the process, but generally speaking, we're in a position where we're automatically handling many of them.
Okay, next in our lightning round, questions for the practitioners. Ben, what is the ratio of attended versus unattended in your domain?
I couldn't possibly take a guess. I would say if I had to, I was, well, we have a very wide range of different robotic technologies now, right? So probably attended would be down at the kind of 10-15% maybe now. You know, we're 5-6 years into it, and we're operating at scale. So you know, it's changed dramatically over the years.
Okay, thank you, Sydney. What does the ratio look like at in your organization?
We are almost at a 50-50 split right now, which is really interesting. So we have a very robust attended automation effort, and then we also have our COE side, and I think they're actually scaling almost side by side as well. So it'll be really interesting to see. I mean, I think just based on the sheer number of developers from a citizen side will eventually surpass the COE side, but I think that's going to take a lot of time before we can incorporate, you know, any Spotifyer that wants to leverage a bot to be able to do that.
Okay, super. So last question is a request for commentary on hyperautomation, right? Meaning beyond RPA. And I know most of you get it. I mean, Mike, you brought this up recently in the discussion, right? Let's not just focus on RPA. Let's kind of focus on where this is all going. So maybe Mike, you could start. What is kind of your what's your mantra? What's your perspective with regard to true hyper automation, managing scale beyond RPA?
Yeah. So really, we refer to it internally as process orchestration, right? So it's that kind of convergence of the different technologies, which is one important element of it, to kind of go deeper and include things like BPM and AI and other components as part of our toolkit. But the other more important part of that is it allows us to go broader in terms of the process, you know, more closer to end-to-end type of automation. right, by bringing in those different technologies and taking a different look at it. Now, hyperautomation might be, kind of, I know it's a specific reserved word, but it can mean different things for different people, right? Different firms.
No, absolutely. So, Paul, hyperautomation, what does that mean to you? And when you address it within your existing clients or future, what does it mean? Or is it or not to lead the witness? Is it just a new term, as Mike alluded to, that people are grabbing hold onto because it just seems exciting and represents the future?
Well, I think it represents the extension past RPA. So RPA hit the market by storm and had a lot of hype associated with it. And everybody bought RPA tools and started automating. The mature organizations realize it's not just about RPA. There's many other methods of automation, to include all the methods Mike had mentioned and Sydney had spoke about as well. Right? There's process automation and natural language processing, machine reasoning, machine learning. I could go on and on. So RPA has its place, but it's not the be all and end all. And as customers realize it's about optimizing the way we do business, and RPA has a role, as well as other automation technologies, and how we mash those together to meet the need, then it becomes really meaningful and we achieve hyperautomation.
That makes total sense. So we're just about there, and apologies to those who submitted questions and that we did not get to them. There will be other additional webinars coming up in the future, and appreciate everyone's time. So first off, I want to thank Paul Pinto, Mike Engel, Sydney Madison, Prescott, Ben Rayner. Thank you all. Very helpful. We appreciate you taking the time. And it was just, it's awesome for us to be able to have someone who's doing this for 6 years. Aren't too many with the 6-year notches in the belt. And Sydney, you just coming on strong as kind of relatively new but experienced user with another very well-known brand name, really helpful. And Mike Engel and Paul Pinto, you guys really on the front end, I would say, of this frontier of companies that are providing this service. So always great to hear your opinion. You're out there every day and getting a sense of where the challenges are and crafting, I would say, commercially viable solutions. Again, I want to thank Kristen Evans. I want to thank Tom Walkett here, Eric Hochstein for helping put this together. As Kristen mentioned early on, there will be a recorded version of this, and I'm sure all sorts of follow-on goodies, merchandise, t-shirt, coffee mug. Who knows if you're on our mailing list. Thanks again. Enjoy the balance of your day. We'll see you at the next webinar. Take care all. Bye-bye now. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.